My name is Jessie Rockberg. I'm the chair of the Department of Near Eastern Studies, and I thank John so much for allowing me the privilege of introducing our speaker and her remarkable work. Anne Goldman is first and foremost an essayist, but that is only first and foremost. Anyone who has read a page of a Goldman essay knows instantly of the depth and intellectual mettle of Anne. She is also a scholar who has her PhD in English from UC Berkeley, and she is a fiction writer. Currently, she is professor of 19th and 20th century English literature and creative writing at Sonoma State University. Anne is author of 4 books, most recently the essay collection Stargazing in the Atomic Age, which we are celebrating this afternoon. Her scholarly work draws attention to the study of race and politics in literary cultures, as seen in her co-edited anthology and guide to the writings of Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton, excuse my pronunciation. In her monograph, Continental Divides, Revisioning American Literature, Goldman achieves what one reviewer called nothing short of the unsettling of New England as the cultural, geographic, and literary center of the United States. The reviewer said, Goldman models the kind of scholarship she advocates, considering Henry James and Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton in light of both authors' treatment of Boston, placing the Mexican-American War alongside the Civil War, highlighting the Western experience of an African-American author. What results is a more complex, nuanced set of readings that are thematically linked by issues of regionality and mobility. And I think we can see the shades or perhaps the presaging of the whole sensibility represented in Stargazing. Her earliest monograph, Take My Word, Autobiographical Innovations of Ethnic American Working Women, which was published by University of California Press, was also praised as a cultural corrective to literary and historical analyses that confine ethnic women's autobiographies within the service of ethnographic representation. Anne's essays, regulars in the Georgia Review, the Southwest Review, the Gettysburg Review, and Michigan Quarterly Review, have garnered critical praise and prizes, including multiple Pushcart Prize nominations and the Pushcart Prize Special Mention. Her essays have been awarded Notable Essay by the Best American Essays in 2007, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2014, 2015, 2017, and 2019. She also received the Best American Science and Nature Writing Notable Essay in 2017 and the Best American Travel Writing Notable Essay in 2015. Her work has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and an Amundsen Getty postdoctoral fellowship, and Sonoma State University has recognized her distinction with a Goldstein Award for Excellence in Scholarship. And so now it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Anne Goldman, scholar, fiction writer, essayist, and my dear friend. Please welcome Anne Goldman.
Thank you so much, Jessie. That was the exact phrase that I was thinking about in my anticipatory thank you to your gracious welcome. It is such a pleasure to have you act as MC and a gracious interlocutor. I so appreciate this. And I want to thank John Efron for inviting me to give a talk at the Center for Jewish Studies, and to Etta Heber, who is behind the scenes and has managed, sort of stage managed this event and so many others on behalf of the center. And last but not least, to Kimmy, who I think is the tech person, who also aids all of us, and me in particular, still sort of stumbling to catch up with the 20th century now that we're in the 21st in terms of technology. I want, finally, last but not least, to thank everyone for tuning in, to my friends and colleagues who are listening, to my daughter Zoe, a fellow writer who is here, to my mother, the first writer in our family, who is listening from Portland and who very early on bought me books that made me want to read. And for aspiring um, creative writers, I would just say, you probably already know this together, but to be a writer is to be a reader first and foremost. So I'm going to go ahead and read for about 30 minutes from the titular essay, Stargazing in the Atomic Age. It's the first essay I wrote quite some time ago, well before the pandemic began. And I worked on it as a kind of object lesson for myself, and a way of exploring the fact that in the worst of circumstances, so I chose the middle of the 20th century and the Holocaust, the astonishing and surprising fact is that some people managed not only just to get by, but to create spectacular achievements in the middle of these circumstances. So I think I'll read it today, portions of it, with the sense that we are in a very difficult position right now, and that perhaps looking at the kinds of intellectual concentration that some of the people I had the pleasure to foreground in this particular book offer us might be a way of providing some kind of model in times when we start to feel exhausted from all the chaos. So this essay foregrounds energy, not the energy dissipated in chaos, but concentrated in thinking and in the thinking of scientists and physicists in particular. But I'm going to begin with a short section that honors my father, my late father, who was a physician and a researcher, a medical researcher in pulmonary physiology. So it begins, "What do you care what other people think?" When I was a girl, my father's behavior in the Boston suburb we lived in struck me as weird. His volatility was embarrassing. His emotionalism was out of place. He was a Rachmaninoff cadence where everyone else played Mozart, a medieval gargoyle perched atop a Lutheran church, a Mai Tai in the midst of the odorless, colorless gin and tonics that were Boston's favorite drink. When I grew up and moved away, I recognized his eccentricity for what it was, the incomplete conversion of this assimilated Jew, all quick, erratic motion and nervous energy, to the phlegmatic chill of New England. Where Dad worked at the Harvard School of Public Health, the atmosphere was cool as the inside of a church, as were the faculty, several of whom he had roomed with at Eliot House 10 years earlier, but never dined alongside, since the university's eating clubs in the 1950s were strictly segregated. In their spacious Cambridge houses, they remained secluded, the graceful curves of high brick walls separating their jade lawns from the jangly street traffic of nearby Harvard Square. In the context of the city's strict composure, an uprightness that hoarded physical energy as if every movement were a waste of vital spirit, my dad's exuberance must have seemed shockingly flamboyant. And indeed, he was all violent activity. He screamed himself hoarse when we squabbled in the car, darted across streets before the walk sign, rifled wildly through the stacks of papers in his office searching for the document he had stashed in some forgotten place because it was important, huffed his way through car dealerships when some hapless salesman offered statistics that contradicted the basic laws of physics, ate too much from the party trays his Harvard colleagues nibbled from, and blew into our house at the end of the day, disheveled but triumphant as some Greek general returning home at the end of the Trojan War. Ignoring my mother's demurrals, my dad typically wore sneakers on the several occasions each year when our family drove into the city to hear the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He commented with gleeful sarcasm on whatever stupidity passed for convention and took the talk of car mechanics more seriously than the abstracts of some of his colleagues, who massaged their data, he felt, rendering their experiments unethical and valueless at a stroke. He spoofed Harvard's sanctimonious dinner parties in the mock prayer with which he inaugurated family suppers. Good food, good meat, good God, let's eat. And aggressively competitive, he never missed an opportunity to let the more socially conscious faculty of the School of Public Health know by example that their inherited facility among the intellectual elite could not stand up to his own uncouth native brilliance. Years later, reading Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman's memoir, "Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman," I recognized in this physicist's indifference to social protocol and his failure to suffer fools gladly a curious character like my dad. Feynman, too, had a low tolerance for mediocrity. A physicist friend at the Lawrence Berkeley Labs remembers that the Nobel winner refused point blank to attend meetings. Fine for his colleagues, he thought, but his own brain was too valuable to idle away in committee. This pronouncement must have met with a mixed reception, but it was delivered with Feynman's usual aplomb. The anecdote he recounted as a new graduate student at Princeton might have been one of my father's own. Feynman could sniff out pretentiousness like a police dog trained to find street drugs. At Princeton, he found plenty of grandiloquence. The university was an imitation of an English school, complete with phony British accents. The master of residences was a professor of French literature who invited him to a tea party, at which he distinguished himself in his inimitable Jewish way. Asked whether he would like cream or lemon in his tea, the scientist replied, "I'll have both, thank you," at which the stricken dean's wife could only manage, "Surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman." Here was my father, except that he, as all four of his children knew, would have asked for 5 spoons of sugar, too. So that's the familial energy with which I grew up. And now I'm going to skip over and broaden the reach to think about Jewish scientists more largely. The Holocaust and Hiroshima are twin icons of the apocalyptic violence that inaugurates the modern age. At the center of both, like it or not, are Jews. If they were half of the 12 million consigned to death in Europe, Jews comprised an even larger percentage of the scientists whose efforts in New Mexico would transform 2 Japanese cities, likewise, into ash. Wartime chronicling, like Holocaust memorialization, is typically painted as a series of 2-dimensional poster boards to victory and defeat. In one, tragedy, the black milk of Ceylon's death fugue. In the other, courage, the Allied effort to win the weapons race against the Nazis. Insulated from each other and from us, these wartime simulacra offer an appropriately dignified version of World War II history as epic, a theater of extraordinary action and heightened emotion. Jettison these, and we lose the monumental grandeur that retrospectively lends coherence to violence. But we obtain a quality of attention that restores to modern Jewish experience its richness and detail. At a minimum, the knowledge that the relatives of the victims of the gas chambers were instrumental in the race to develop the most potent weapons on earth should give us pause. In the disparate countenances of these scientists, a range of feeling too mixed to find a place within the exalted rhetoric of wartime contest, an alloy of rage and hope resisting ruin. Juxtapose a photograph of the physicist who worked in Los Alamos side by side with a picture taken through the barbed wire mesh of Auschwitz. In the memorial photograph, breathing stick figures stare back at you. Too emaciated to stand up straight, they still pose for the camera. Their black eyes smolder, guttered fires that will flame up again at the slightest provocation of air. Turn to the equally famous image of Albert Einstein, and the accomplishments as well as afflictions of Jewish lives in the 20th century come into focus. Einstein, his Mona Lisa smile at odds with the sad dark eyes, large and lustrous and fringed with lashes heavy as half-drawn curtains. And then there is the sidelong smile itself, the very icon of Jewish experience with its marvelous shades of feeling, bittersweet and rueful, lilting as the minor-keyed clarinet melodies of klezmer music, a little melancholy, a little mocking, epigrammatic, knowing. A smile that is ironic and romantic and pragmatic, quizzical without bemusement, nostalgic for a childhood paradise it recognizes it never enjoyed, slightly superior but hesitant, hovering at the corners of the mouth like a watcher at the edges of a party, a flirtatious smile that mutates from seduction to sadness in an instant, a glancing smile with the head turned a quarter turn away from you, yet that still engages you steadfastly and squarely with the j'accuse that neither Jews nor non-Jews would ever mistake for mere abstractedness. The time has come to return this sidelong look with an equally searching gaze, foregoing the satisfactions of bereavement, at least momentarily, in order to examine more complicated solutions to the untenable choices history offers. Einstein, we know, refused to become involved in the wartime science that would translate his famous theory into its most destructive practice. But many other Jewish physicists were instrumental in the work the young Feynman saw as necessary, given what he called, with his penchant for understatement, the fright of Germany's militarism. Their hearts beating faster in the thin desert air, the physicists who gathered at Los Alamos waved away mourning, foregoing Kaddish as they bent their heads together in the race to solve each day's scientific problems. The clamor of the lab's cafeteria refused the myth of silence, Europe's slow procession of shades packing their bags to hell without sound or sigh. The mathematical language these physicists spoke was competitive, argumentative, barely containable at presto tempo. At Norway's Norsk hydro plant, Nazi engineers oversaw the stepped-up production of heavy water, water laced with deuterium, the hydrogen isotope whose denser molecular structure releases neutrons that moderate and control the reactions that split uranium atoms. Learning of this effort from a Dutch colleague who had been expelled from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, Einstein wrote a letter of warning to Roosevelt. The president did not immediately pay attention to this resident alien, of whom the FBI pronounced in the early 1940s, "This office would not recommend the employment of Dr. Einstein on matters of a secret nature without a very careful investigation, as it seems unlikely that a man of his background could, in such a short time, become a loyal American citizen." In the end, many scientists of his background, socialists and Jews, were invited to collaborate upon the New Mexican-based bomb project administered by Robert J. Oppenheimer, himself blacklisted after the war. In an irony we would do well to acknowledge, it was the refugee from Hungary, Edward Teller, who later spoke most vociferously against this young American. Oppenheimer gave 20 hours of each day and some 30 pounds on an already too slender frame to the Manhattan Project. Still, in 1954, he was essentially tried for disloyalty, his security clearances permanently revoked, his legacy ineradicably blackened. In the early 1940s, however, the tensions between the impolitic Jewish refugee and the urban scion of a wealthy Jewish American family were shoved aside. The escaped scientist who occupied side-by-side offices at Los Alamos had been spat at and despised by Europe. Above deep Atlantic seas, from the decks of ocean liners, they watched home recede beyond the horizon line, but not beyond memory. Reviled by the countries that would forever remain their native lands, is it any wonder they chose an affiliation that made more respectful use of their intellectual gifts? In New Mexico, they substituted cooperation and what Feynman condescendingly labeled engineering in place of the pure silent science that gave to their lives its rare and sustaining grace. Like other brilliant people fortunate enough to find outlets for self-expression in their work, these physicists possess the ability to become so wholly absorbed in concentration that the separate antiphonies of self resolved momentarily into a single clear note. Such joy they sacrificed for a time at Los Alamos, shelving the questions and musings that surfaced at odd moments of the day to remind them of their real interests so that they could, committee-like, construct a bomb. But for the refugees particularly, I suspect a certain degree of camaraderie, the fellowship they had once enjoyed in their own labs in Europe until it became unalterably compromised in the 1930s, compensated for the temporary sensation of their larger concerns. Much scholarly collaboration is an uneasy mix of people in suspension rather than solution. The scientists at Los Alamos, with their inside jokes and their Sunday walks in the canyons, their summer camp dormitory arrangements and their weekend parties, were fiercely competitive as only the intellectually self-possessed can be, but united in their common aim, their respect for one another's work, even paradoxically, their maverick iconoclasm. Those of us born decades after World War II have been raised in the long shadow of nuclear fallout. We know apocalypse as unpleasant fact, a slow toxicity, radiation deposited in our bones from yearly X-rays, the painstaking accretion of mercury in our blood, the thickening and blurring of our atmosphere with carcinogenic fuel emissions that we no longer see the horizon of clear days. And of course, we can add the emissions from fires and the virus that is currently bouncing back and forth between people and animals and back again. Of course, the scientists gathered in Los Alamos during wartime would have preferred pursuing their own work. Questions about the formation of the stars, the as yet unnamed forces far more potent than gravity that seem to be keeping whole constellations from collapsing, the origin of the universe itself. These large, ennobling problems had occupied them before the petty but virulent spite of human conflicts redirected their collective intelligences toward the service of weaponry. For them, apocalypse was imminent. The silence from their families overseas would have sounded loud as the hiss of a blank tape. Worry about their welfare would have clouded their focus and destroyed their concentration, so they must have been grateful to be occupied. Late in the war, reports of barracks constructed with the sole object of dispatching those they housed to oblivion had begun to circulate in the classified circles many of the scientists were privy to. In these shadowy death cities that had sprung up on the edges of ordinary towns, clocks marked the hours from waking to work to extinction in grotesque imitation of quotidian rhythm. How strange to wake to this purity of sun and light in New Mexico instead. The blue dome of sky contoured by clouds, the pinon and scrub pines falling away on the slopes below you, the peaks of the Jemez Range on the far horizon deepening the clear expanse till it appeared profound as the space between stars. Los Alamos offered the long view, the mesas slow to crumble, the half-lives of stones carved by wind, and the endless cycle of sunlight, a geologic measure that reduced all the grandeur and grimness of the last 500 years of European history to a second's shadow across the sun. No wonder Oppenheimer chose this place, the same one he had ridden across so often as a young man, with the few companions strong enough to weather his 14-hour stretches on horseback. On the weekends, the scientists hiked with him up the rock faces of the mesas surrounding their temporary quarters and studied their palms against the sun-warmed contours of stone. Breathing hard in the thin air, did they see the dark mirages of their families waver on the horizon? And I'm going to skip again to go back to Einstein briefly and venture very far back to Maimonides. Einstein himself had lectured at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in the 1920s amid jeers from rioting students. But the gall of self-disgust was foreign to him. The mathematical language he listened to was exponentially more powerful than such inconsequential spite. He did not labor to counter derision with his quick-witted aphorisms. These quips were merely a byproduct of his own high-spirited energy. Irrepressibly cheerful, he chose the larger world over the small-minded one. In place of the cowering, downcast gaze, he substituted time looking up at the stars. Because intellectual work requires intense concentration, he knew, it releases us momentarily from the constraints of ego, the small resentments, jealousies, dissatisfactions, and annoyances that becloud perception. The sacred is tied as closely to human effort, properly disciplined and appropriately focused, as to divinity itself. that wind from God sweeping over the water, as Genesis frames what is external to the material world and human consciousness. Metaphysical understanding shares with science an interest in principles. Einstein's longing to achieve scientific clarity echoes the yearning of religious scholars to arrive at insight into the divine. And the physicist's language of prayer is thinking. The muscular contractions that push blood through our arteries and oxygenate the receptive tissues of the brain, the bronchial tubes that expand and contract with every breath, the dendrites and ganglia that stir with each thought, signals jumping from neuron to neuron in a pattern swift and untraceable as blinking lights in the night sky. With these conduits, we work toward an understanding of things outside ourselves. Respiration and inspiration, physics and physic, the medieval clerics knew as well as we that metaphysics was a miracle of breath and pulse, of body and mind working in concert to trace pathways from the pattern millions of nerves and neurons inside to the pattern millions of stars outside. To be a doctor was to be a rabbi, to see how physiology permits philosophy, and how philosophy in its turn shadows God. Like muscle tissue, which atrophies or increases in girth according to our own determined effort, thinking quickens or slackens in concert with the intellectual demands we make of ourselves. We think in order to approach an understanding of the deepest spiritual questions, Maimonides argued. But the power to speculate is not simply conferred upon the heads of the appropriately pious. Reverence, that quality the Puritan culture of New England tends to associate with piety, with decorum, with an unquestioned obedience to duty, is for Jews often connected with desire, not the effort to suffocate it, with intellectual skepticism, not catechism, and with an independence of mind that always, always supersedes collective wisdom. Close to a millennium later, Einstein practiced a similar intellectual faith. He did not give up this faith ever, not when his cautions to the US government about German war efforts resulted in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, not when the bomb over Hiroshima stilled the city before the nerve signals registering its brilliant ravaging could make their way to his own brain were within hours of ceasing. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. If Einstein inaugurated the modern scientific age, he was still a child of Descartes. The day he died of a stomach aneurysm, he lay in his hospital bed writing out equations. And I will skip to the close of this piece, and thank you so much for listening. Asking questions, not supplying ready answers, makes good science. Here we come full circle to the traditions of study explained by Shlomo ben Isaac and Maimonides, traditions sustained by Talmudic study to this day. In What Do You Care What Other People Think? That's his second memoir, Feynman recalls a discussion of electricity he led for a class of rabbinical students in New York City. He assumed with his usual arrogance that science would best the religious logic, but they were 10 times quicker than he was. And then here, this is Feynman talking. As soon as they saw I could put them in a hole, they went twist, turn, twist. I can't remember how, and they were free. I thought I'd come up with an original idea. Phooey, it had been discussed in the Talmud for ages. Here is the Jew as escape artist, the intellectual Houdini who wriggles free of his chains and slips out of confinement, the wartime refugee who eludes the Shoah with the light-footedness as a starvation diet allows. In the midst of gloom, the lilt of klezmer music, an alto clarinet kicking up its heels like a wedding dancer, a hint of melancholy in the minor key played at allegro tempo, and always ideas, intellectual fission released as marvelous, uncontainable energy. Then there is Feynman himself, an imp who writes of his safe-cracking and lock-picking tricks with uncontainable glee. In the ironclad security of Los Alamos, the scientist is a human dust devil blowing away other scientists before his antics like tumbleweeds in fright. And this again is from his memoir. I went back to the first filing cabinet and click, it opened. Now I could write a safecracker book that would beat everyone. I opened safes whose contents were more valuable than what any safecracker anywhere had opened, except for a life, of course. The safes which contained all the secrets to the atomic bomb, the schedules for the production of the plutonium, the purification procedures, how much materials is needed, how the bomb works, how the neutrons are generated, what the design is, the dimensions, the entire information that was known at Los Alamos, the whole schmear. At the heart of darkness, this sprite, exposing security flies and defying gravitas, sidestepping sermon, mocking seriousness, delighting in his own brilliance, with a childlike openness that deflates any claim to destructive self-importance. Much scientific brilliance was volunteered at Los Alamos in service of weapons that remain the vanishing point for our own nightmares. But death, destruction, and the world laid waste need not be the end of the story. The same wartime refugees, outsiders like Albert Einstein, Wolfgang Pauli, and Emilio Segre, have given the Earth its location among the stars, explored galaxies at the outer edge of the universe, discovered the forces that keep the void of space from collapsing in upon itself, else no Earth, no sun, no stars, no universe. Why see the faces of Jewish people only as the fallen leaves of history scuttling this way and that according to an ill-intentioned German wind? At the very period memorialized by history as a dead loss, an era of unspeakable suffering whose endpoint is a mass vanishing, Jews remade the cosmos. The nadir of Jewish history marks the greatest profusion of scientific ideas since Newton, and these physicists, pushed malignly to the edges and then out of sight of Europe altogether, were central to its flourishing. The omniscient grandeur earliest centuries gave to the angels the scientists bestowed on themselves, not as creators, but with the humility of intelligent watchers. They contemplated the beginnings of time and its end, watched as stars exploded, imploded, and exploded again, their materials coming to momentary rest in the iron of our blood and bones. Not passive, not waiting, not paralyzed by despair, the people pushed to the margins of their own townships traveled out to expand boundaries most of us could not even invent, much less understand. The destructive energy that found a language in the barked commands of mid-century wartime was nothing to these scientists' positively charged masses, volatile with ideas, exuberant with the momentum of insights they knew were inescapable, transforming. I could not understand the simplest physics equation to save my life, but the cocky insouciance for what other people will say conforms closely to my familial experience. I recognize in Feynman's inimitable self-possession an ebullience akin to my father's brashness, as well as an impatience with the social rituals of the less curious who took refuge in site visits and committee meetings while he wanted only to be in the lab. Intellectual tendentiousness and a sublime lack of fear at jettisoning accepted wisdom is my inheritance too, albeit in a different academic environment than the research medicine that is my father's profession or the theoretical physics that is the province of so many Jewish scientists. Effortless as the body's memory and as poised, the gift of intellectual brashness opens to a kind of secular faith. The math may be performed by supercomputers in windowless labs, but still it's stargazing that catalyzes such scientific inquiry. What more spiritual than this unbalancing looking up at the dome of sky, your hands raised slightly to compensate for your body's tilting, your head thrown back, this open-throated but unspeakable yearning, this willingness to connect to what is beyond the self that ends in rapturous acceptance of the world's mystery. Here, the past is not burden, nor a bitterness without balm. Instead, it curves toward the future, just as, looking up, we think beyond our present moment, illuminated by starlight from places gone before all of us, nation after nation, people after people began, slow as a flower's unfurling, to move from the crouch of 4 feet to learn the upright stance that makes stargazing possible. What more curious gift than the capacity we have of bending time, the way a few moments recalled in the lightning flashes of memory obliterate the darkness of difficult years. Such refugee scientists show us that against humanity's timeless cruelty, ancient problems from hell translated into modern genocide, we also possess some understanding of relativity as an interest beyond our own footing. Intellectual work can move equally towards serenity as tragedy. What drives insight is not the pain of loss, but a transporting recognition that is outside of the body altogether, outside of humanness even, a floating upward heedless of gravity that connects us with what the Greeks called the ether and what we still do not know to name. Science and art extend themselves hopefully as Chagall's lovers, connected by the hands as they leave the ground. And time is the key. Perhaps this is what occupies Jewish physicists in their exploration of the universe, a means to recapture a sense of time as marvel, stretching behind us and in front of us like the seas upon which continents float. In place of the Holocaust engulfing light and air, they listened for a wind over the darkness that portends movement, a stir of atmosphere, the gesture toward presence, a quickening from absence. This conception is ancient and again modern, and no more miraculous than the idea that our own universe, anchored where and floating in what, if not more space, will itself grow to fullness, to the edges of time, then contract all time back into itself. A trillion measures slower, yes, than the memory of human life, but sure as the rhythmic rise and fall of our own breathing. Thank you. And I apologize for the verbal stumbling. It's been a while since I have read for that long.
No apologies necessary. Thank you so much, Anne, for these beautiful and evocative excerpts from the collection, evocative of your own personal history, evocative of the mid-20th century Los Alamos and its grim mission, and then radiating out into the metaphysical realm and its refraction in Jewish thought. It was really quite marvelous. So if I may, I would like to start the discussion off with a question that I have that will allow you to draw on some of the other essays in the collection. The essay Antecedent is a reflection upon the Exodus story, and it primes the readers to see the book's other essays as stories of wanderers. You return to this idea in the essay that yokes Einstein and Mozart, entitled Dislocation and Invention, a Fugue. I was personally quite intrigued at the linkage of science and music. And so I want to ask you if you can talk about why you chose to invoke Einstein in relation to Mozart in particular as wanderers or in other respects. And if you can also in this context address the importance for your thinking of the link between physics and music, or more generally science and art.
Thank you for that question. And so I'll start with Einstein and Mozart. It surprised me how often Mozart, how many appearances Mozart made into the essays in this book. And I think part of that is that the people I wrote about share a reverence for mystery. And I think there's a way for them, and perhaps for Einstein in particular, that Mozart's music is a kind of way of working toward that wonder, that it speaks that wonder. At the end of the war in 1945, Alfred Einstein, who it's not clear whether or not he's a distant cousin of the physicist, published a biography of Mozart that, and I'm speaking not as a musicologist, but just as a music devotee, but I believe it's still sort of fundamental to the field. And in it, Alfred Einstein considers Mozart so beyond the marvelous that he discusses Mozart as not of this world. And that's what comes up also in Einstein's commentary very often on Mozart, is a sense of, I think, of relief at moving beyond national divides, of a music that seems not inflected by the particular tropes that we associate with cultural practices that we can hear even in some other composers, but rather someone who seemed too urbane and too cosmopolitan and too much of a wanderer himself to be affiliated with any one nation state. So I think that's part of it. I think also Einstein, for Mozart and also for a lot of the other figures here, I'm sorry, for Mozart, is somebody really from the 18th century, an age still of that we focus and in which we focus on foreground balance. And I think it was the lack of balance in part that probably appealed, the balance in Mozart and the lack of balance in life in the 20th century that appealed to some of these physicists. And at the same time, I think in Mozart, at least what I hear in Mozart, is a wit, an intelligence, and a lightness even in grief, even when I listen to andantes and adagios that are suffused with grief, there's the same lightness. And I think that kind of way of maneuvering is something that probably appealed to these scientists, Einstein in specific, but Jewish scientists in general, who had been torn away from their own homes. So that is, I think, one thing. I think the other way that I think through music and science is to think about music and math as in some way pure languages, if you will, than the language that we use, that literary people use. And I'll get at that in a roundabout way. I mean, I think music is the language of feeling, but it's also an art in time. So words on the page stay fixed on the page, but music moves across time. So it's possible for some of these physicists that listening to music was a way they could think and return to their own ideas and questions about parsing time and about the time-space continuum, but doing so in a way that moved through thinking rather than through thought experiment. So perhaps in a strange way, music provided them with a kind of fugue state, and I guess I'm playing on a term in music itself, but a fugue state that sort of allowed them to think on contrapuntally about their own work as scientists.
Yeah, yeah. I don't see any questions in the chat. If I can encourage people to write in, but while we're waiting, I want to follow up a little bit on what you just said. So in thinking about Mozart and the structural and sort of the structural purity of his music and the very sensibility of it in relation to mathematical language, I would immediately think about Euclid.
Yeah.
But you play on the role of Mandelbrot and the fractal geometry in the essays. And so if you could talk a little bit about the non-Euclidean importance of Mandelbrot, and also what, you know, what power that had in our popular imagination regarding fractals and chaos and so on.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, the fractal is, it's harder to see the patterns of repetition. And a fractal is sort of loosely defined as a geometric figure that is characterized by recursive self-similar features at different scales. And that can be really easy to see in, for instance, one of my favorite veggies, the Romanesco.
Yeah.
You can see it in some ferns, but Mandelbrot saw it in the shapes of clouds and the contours of coastlines. He also saw how it worked in the stock market, and that it offered a way of thinking about what would appear to be the arbitrary sort of rises and crashes in the stock market, or rather, and he was delighted to sort of do this, to kind of puncture the balloon. The ways that other people had of thinking about the stock market, he sort of swept aside and suggested that that it operated according to a fractal scale. But I think what I would say is that so for somebody like Mandelbrot himself, who had these extraordinary math skills and could look at very complicated algebraic equations and see immediately geometric shapes in his mind, for him, those kinds of fractal shapes probably came all at once, and he could see them. But for the rest of us, I think one way of thinking about them is to think about the fact that they are still patterns of repetition, but they're repetitions too complex for us to see. So for instance, in physics, like the notion of turbulence, or and we think about this with weather. So they are repetitions, but they're not as easy to see. But I do think of one way of thinking through this, for me, of approaching it, is maybe to think about Bach over and against Mozart, and in particular of Bach's like even the 2 or 3 part inventions. And when you listen to those, you hear fugues, you hear independent melodies. You don't hear the kinds of harmonies so much that you hear in Mozart, and in an opera like, say, Così fan tutte, which is, to my mind, has the most just gorgeous arias, and and interestingly, they're all duets and trios and quartets. But with Bach, you have to hold in mind these different, you see these different musical shapes, these sonic forms, how they interact, and they interact not as chords so much as different melodic lines that start in different places, and whose shapes, if you were going to and I'm way out of my element here, but if you were going to think about them in terms of the amplitudes and troughs of their sound patterns, would sort of intersect in different places. So, but yes, in terms of thinking beyond non-Euclidean geometry, I mean, I think that's where the relativity of time gets us to, ultimately, and of bending and morphing what earlier centuries saw as fixed, of moving. Even in literature, you can see it. Grace Paley writes that she's not interested in plot because she wants to give her characters the possibility of an open destiny, so that rather than feel like there's one arrow of time, she doesn't cling to that. And even a poet like Emily Dickinson, when you look, and I see now that I'm skipping over fields a little bit blithely, but if you look at those poems on the page, there's very little end-stopped punctuation, and instead they sort of quiver there like molecules. So there again, these are ways of pushing against, even in the 19th century, even with somebody like Dickinson who used meter. But one of the things that's so fascinating to me about her are poems in which that bend time in the same way. And the poem, I could not, because I could not stop for death, if you read that poem, there's a place in the center of the poem where the meter switches, and it's a little bit like what it feels like to have an arrhythmia in the heart. And what that does is to make you realize that time is relative. And because you're so used to hearing these sound patterns, and then they get stopped by this one shift in the meters. So I think that there may in fact be people who are working toward relativity and shapes that don't seem to conform to the hard lines that we might associate with earlier eras, and more to these very convoluted, intricate whirling shapes that Mandelbrot in particular was interested in. So I'm sorry, that's a very wide-ranging answer.
So I'm seeing an interesting question from the chat. regarding Jewish intellectuals and Mozart, Saul Bellow also thought of Mozart as not of this world. And Mark Cohen, I believe, is saying this, and he knows your essay on Bellow and how greatly you regard him. So I would invite you to reflect here a little bit more on Bellow, either with respect to Mozart or in some other respect.
Thank you, Mark, for that question. Yes, and thank you for reading the Bellow piece. Yeah, I think that temperamentally, there was a way that there's something febrile in Bellow. And when you look at characters like Augie March, and in particular Herzog, and I always think of Herzog sort of lying out there, his personal life in an absolute mess, but looking up at the stars, even while Meister like eating away in inside of his, you know, room inside. But there is a lightness there. There is a sense of and an expansiveness, and a sense of the metaphysical. And maybe it's that Bellow enjoyed so much about Mozart. I mean, I think the quickness, with which Mozart chases moods across a few measures. We don't get marches that kind of just are in lockstep for a whole movement. We get periods, we get feelings that change the way sun changes when it's when light is sort of dappled by cloud. And I think that sense of quickness and the sure-footedness that Mozart had, and his capaciousness, and once again the fact that he looked up more than down, that he wasn't interested in thinking about nation states, but rather about what unites us, that perhaps is something that Bellow found appealing.
Yeah, okay, well, I think I'm going to step in here and grab the last question, if I may.
Sure.
I was so taken with the hybrid structure of this book. It's part intellectual history, part reverie on art and science, and part personal history. My question is, what moved you to work in and between these ways of seeing, rather than operating squarely from within only one?
Yeah, I think there are a number of answers to that, and I'm actually going to give a nod to a fellow essayist, Laura Sewell-Mutter, with whom I not too long ago published a sort of conversation about stargazing in the atomic age, and she asked some lovely questions and made some comments that were useful for me. And she framed the book. She said, "Well, it seems like it's doing a number of things. It's about creativity." And so this is Laura Sewell-Mutter here, not me. A book about creativity and its redemptive powers. It's a book about displacement and the ways that can sometimes contribute to creativity. It's a book about recurrent patterns, a literary fractal of sorts. And it's a book about family and how sometimes to understand those closest to us, we have to look for correspondences in people at a further remove. And I am grateful for her, for finding all of that. And I think for me, I mean, my initial answer is always to say like location. I wanted to use the personal voice because I think about, for instance, the fact that we live in a small solar system in a dinky, out of the way galaxy, and maybe we should think about that. We're not as central as we would like to make out. We're not sort of figureheads on the faces of coins with very little in the background. And my way of trying to reminding myself of my own perspective and of bringing myself, of remaining humble, was to keep that eye sort of dancing in and out of the picture, and for me to be always aware, well, this is my view, and maybe just my view at a particular point in time as well. But I think, ultimately, I began this book in this way without really thinking about it, but I think it was because, so it just sort of, just how I work things out on the page, pretty blindly at first, but I think it was because I had so many different interests that I wanted to explore. I wanted to develop, I wanted to try to bring some light into a period that is so engulfed in darkness that we can't see anything. I mean, if you don't have any contrast, if there's nothing but darkness, you don't even know what darkness is after a while. So, you know, so I think that was one of the things I was interested in. I think one of the other things was to think through my family life from a remove, and then to think about what it's like, what it would be like to be a painter or a musician or a physicist, and basically to, for a little bit, to not be a literary person, but to think through how astonishing it would be to try to ask questions and work towards solutions in people who work in different fields.
Yeah, well, I think it's marvelous how the lightness and expansiveness that you've pulled out of all of the central figures of these essays, Einstein, Mozart, Feynman, Mandelbrot, not to mention Bellow and the artists Chagall and Rothko. Really, I think lightness and expansiveness is absolutely characteristic of this work. And so I thank you for that. And thank everyone for coming.
Thank you
It's
all
been a real pleasure.
so very, very much. I appreciate the time. I know I'm going to be like parroting Southwest Airlines in the days when we all used to take planes, but you know, we know you have many choices when you fly, and thank you for choosing us. And I know that everybody is glazed over at watching at being on TV all the time. So I so thank you. Thank you all so very much.
Thanks, everyone.